The courtroom was quiet now, the echoes of debate and judgment fading into stillness. Judge Marcus Hill sat at the bench, his gavel resting lightly in his hand. The room felt heavier than usual, though he had long grown accustomed to the weight of decisions made here. Today, he had brought an arduous case to a close, a dispute that had gripped the local news for weeks. As the final papers were signed and the last words spoken, there was no applause, no visible relief, only the subdued shuffle of people leaving, carrying their grievances and hopes into the world beyond. Marcus stayed behind, as he often did, letting the moment linger. His chambers awaited him, a private sanctuary of law books and memories. But for now, he sat alone in the quiet, his gaze lingering on the empty rows of seats where so many lives had been laid bare before him. The decision had been fair. He knew that, not because it was easy, but because fairness was rarely comfortable. The case, a dispute over land rights that unearthed years of deep-seated resentment, was resolved with the same meticulous care he had applied to every ruling in his decades-long career. Yet Marcus knew the world outside this courthouse did not always move with such precision. Justice, he had learned, was a fragile thing, painstaking to build, perilously easy to shatter. As he gathered his belongings to leave, his eyes caught the framed photograph on his desk. His late wife, Eleanor, smiled back at him, her presence still a comfort even after all these years. Beside her picture was a small plaque, a gift from his colleagues upon his appointment to the bench. Justice begins with understanding. It had become his mantra, though there were days when it felt more like a reminder of how far society had yet to travel. Marcus stepped into the cool evening air, his tailored suit catching the last rays of sunlight. The courthouse stood at the heart of the city, its grand pillars a testament to ideals that often faltered under the weight of reality. He walked to his car, a black sedan that he had purchased not for its flash but for its reliability, a car that spoke of quiet success rather than ostentation. As he eased into the driver's seat and turned the key, the hum of the engine filled the silence. He exhaled slowly, his mind drifting to the week ahead. Another case, another set of lives intersecting briefly with his own. The work was unending, but he took solace in its purpose. If justice could not always prevail in the world, at least it could find refuge in his courtroom. The streets of his neighborhood stretched out before him, lined with well-kept lawns and stately homes. It was a place he had worked tirelessly to reach, a space that felt safe, though not entirely immune to the world's prejudices. Here, people waved politely but rarely lingered in conversation. Privacy was a cherished currency, one he valued as much as his neighbors. Yet even in this sanctuary, Marcus carried an unspoken awareness that for some, his presence in this neighborhood still felt like an anomaly. As he drove, his thoughts turned to Eleanor again. She would have loved this neighborhood. She had always found joy in the small, quiet moments, tending to her garden, greeting the mailman, baking pies for the church fundraisers. Marcus smiled faintly at the memory, his grip on the steering wheel softening. It was then, as he turned onto Elmwood Drive, that the flash of blue lights caught his attention, his rearview mirror filled with the strobing glare of a police cruiser. Cutting through the twilight like a blade, Marcus slowed, his mind calculating reflexively. He checked the speedometer, well within the limit. His license and registration were in order. There was no reason for this. He pulled to the side of the road, his movements deliberate. As the cruiser came to a stop behind him, Marcus adjusted his tie, his pulse steady but unmistakably present. This was not the first time he had been stopped, and he doubted it would be the last. For all his accomplishments, for all the respect he commanded in the courtroom, out here on the street he was just another black man in a nice car. The officer approached, her steps measured, her posture rigid. Through the open window, Marcus could see her hand resting on the holstered weapon at her side. She was young, perhaps early 30s, with the sharp, practiced demeanor of someone who believed in their authority without question. License and registration, she said, her tone curt. Marcus handed her the documents without a word, his expression calm, betraying none of the simmering frustration beneath. This was not new to him. He had argued constitutional law, deliberated on the most intricate points of justice. And yet here he was, reduced to proving that he belonged. The officer glanced at his license, her eyes narrowing as they darted between the photo and the man before her. There it was. That flicker of doubt, of suspicion, that Marcus had come to know so well. Is this your car? She asked. The words weighted with unspoken assumptions. Yes. Marcus replied evenly. Is there a problem, officer? The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him with a scrutiny that felt invasive, as though she were searching for cracks in the facade she believed she saw. Marcus remained still, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Years of experience had taught him that even the smallest gesture could be misinterpreted. The evening air was cool, but Marcus could feel the warmth rising in his chest. The familiar anger he had learned to temper. He had spent his life fighting for justice. Yet in moments like this, he was reminded of how easily it could be stripped away. Not by law, but by perception. By the silent, corrosive force of prejudice. The officer's voice cut through the silence. Step out of the car. And so, with the quiet dignity that had carried him through a lifetime of battles, Marcus complied. Officer Grace Carter adjusted her sunglasses. The late evening sun casting long shadows across the quiet streets of the Elmwood neighborhood. The patrol car hummed softly beneath her, a familiar rhythm that had become second nature in her years on the force. The streets here were pristine. The kind of place where lawns were mowed every Saturday morning and mailboxes gleamed under careful polish. It was a neighborhood built on a promise of security and order, qualities she was sworn to protect. Her gaze swept over the houses as she drove, her mind cataloging the details. A jogger passed by, earbuds in place, barely glancing her way. A couple of children played on a driveway. Their chalk drawings splashed across the asphalt in pastel colors. All ordinary, all peaceful, yet Grace couldn't shake the nagging sense of unease that had followed her all day. It was part of the job, she told herself. Always stay vigilant, always be prepared. As she turned a corner, her eyes caught sight of a black sedan rolling smoothly down the road. The car was sleek, understated but clearly expensive. Her instincts sharpened. The car didn't fit, not in the way the minivans and compact SUVs of the neighborhood did. It was too polished, too deliberate. Her hand moved to the radio almost instinctively. Dispatch. This is Unit 4-5. Black sedan on Elmwood Drive. Possible suspicious vehicle. Running plates now. The response came quickly, a crisp confirmation that sent a ripple of anticipation through her. Grace glanced back at the sedan, her fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel. She didn't recognize the driver. An older black man in a tailored suit. He didn't look like trouble. Not on the surface. But surfaces could be deceiving. She had learned that much early on in her career. Grace slowed her car as the sedan came to a stop at a corner. The driver seemed calm, unaware of her scrutiny. She thought about driving past, letting the moment go, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way the car gleamed in the setting sun. An unspoken statement that seemed to challenge the quiet simplicity of the neighborhood. Or maybe it was the stories she had heard, about break-ins, car thefts, the small, creeping threats that disrupted places like this. It only took one moment of inattention for something to go wrong. She activated her lights. The sudden flash of blue cut through the suburban calm, startling a few sparrows perched on a nearby fence. The sedan pulled over smoothly, the driver's signal blinking in perfect rhythm. Grace parked behind him, her heart beating just a little faster as she stepped out of the cruiser. Her boots hit the pavement with practiced precision. The air was cool, but she felt a bead of sweat forming beneath her collar. She approached the driver's side window, her hand resting lightly on the holster at her hip. It was protocol, she reminded herself. Nothing personal, just caution. The window rolled down, and she got her first clear look at the man inside. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s or early 60s, with neatly trimmed gray hair and a steady gaze that met hers without flinching. His suit was immaculate, the kind of tailoring that spoke of money and confidence. Grace felt a flicker of doubt, quickly smothered by the rigidity of her training. License and registration, she said, her tone firm but neutral. The man compiled without hesitation, reaching into the glove compartment with deliberate care. His movements were slow, unthreatening, but Grace felt her grip on her holster tighten. Just slightly. It wasn't fear. Exactly. More a reflex. An automatic response to a lifetime of conditioning. As she examined his documents, her eyes drifted to the name. Marcus Hill, asterisk. It meant nothing to her, though she suspected it might to someone else. She glanced at the car, then back at the man. Something about the combination didn't sit right with her, though she couldn't articulate why. Is this your car? She asked. Her voice edged with suspicion. Yes, he replied, his tone calm but firm. Is there a problem, officer? Grace hesitated. There wasn't a problem, not one she could name. But there was something. An instinct. A feeling that had guided her through countless shifts on the job. She ignored the voice in her head that whispered of fairness, of giving him the benefit of the doubt. Instead, she leaned into the unease. The unspoken belief that had been drilled into her. Always be cautious. Always assume the worst. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area, she said finally, her words measured but pointed. Your car matches the description of one that was reported stolen. The man's expression didn't change, but Grace thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, annoyance. Perhaps. Or resignation. He didn't argue, didn't protest. He simply nodded, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I can assure you, officer, this car isn't stolen, he said evenly. I live in this neighborhood. Grace tilted her head slightly, studying him. The response was plausible, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was rehearsed. Too smooth. She glanced at the houses around them, their windows glinting in the fading sunlight. A few curtains shifted as neighbors peeked out, drawn by the flashing lights. Step out of the vehicle, she said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. The man hesitated, just for a moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, he opened the door and stepped out. He moved slowly, deliberately, his hands visible at all times. Grace felt the weight of her authority in that moment, the silent power that came with the badge on her chest. Yet beneath it was something else, a nagging discomfort she couldn't quite name. The neighborhood was still, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the soft hum of idling engines. As Grace began her search, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not just by the man before her, but by the silent judgment of the world she had sworn to protect. Marcus Hill stood beside his car, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He adjusted his suit jacket with steady hands, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. He had spent decades cultivating a life of dignity and success, but none of that seemed to matter now. To the officer in front of him, he was just a man who didn't belong. Officer Grace Carter moved with purpose, though her movements carried an edge of hesitation. She opened the car's door carefully, glancing back at Marcus as if expecting him to protest. He didn't. Instead, he stood quietly, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the streetlights, far removed from the unfolding scene. Grace crouched slightly to inspect the interior of the car. It was spotless. No fast food wrappers, no loose change, nothing out of place. The leather seats gleamed under the fading light, their polished surfaces offering no clues to validate her suspicions. She opened the glove compartment and found a small stack of neatly organized documents, insurance papers, a maintenance log. Nothing unusual. Still, she kept searching. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a few neighbors gathering at their windows, their silhouettes framed by the soft glow of lamps. Some had stepped onto their porches, their curiosity piqued by the flashing lights and the quiet tension in the air. Grace felt their eyes on her, a silent chorus of questions and judgments. Marcus could feel them too, their presence like an invisible thread binding him to this moment. He thought of how quickly whispers could travel in a place like this. Tomorrow, perhaps even tonight, his neighbors will talk. They would speculate about what had happened, their assumptions shaped by the biases they might not even recognize. He could almost hear the words. Did you see the police? That black man in the nice car? What do you think he was doing here? Grace moved to the trunk, gesturing for Marcus to unlock it. He did so without a word, his hand steady as he pressed the button on his key fob. The trunk lid rose slowly, revealing a briefcase and a few shopping bags. She opened the briefcase and found folders filled with legal briefs, The kind of meticulous notes that spoke of long hours and careful preparation. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar language of statutes and case law. "Nice briefcase," she muttered, her voice low but audible enough for Marcus to hear. "Must be one of those businessmen." Her words hung in the air, a subtle jab that carried more weight than she realized. Marcus didn't respond. He had heard comments like this before, always framed as casual observations but laced with assumptions. He chose silence, knowing that anything he said could be twisted, misunderstood. Grace finished her search and stepped back, her expression unreadable. The car was cleaner than she had expected. Perhaps cleaner than she wanted it to be. She glanced at Marcus, her earlier confidence faltering slightly. There was no evidence to support her suspicions. Yet the doubt lingered. "You're clear," she said, though the words felt reluctant. "But I'm going to need to take you down to the station to sort this out." Marcus turned to her, his face calm but his voice edged with quiet incredulity. "To the station? On what grounds?" Grace crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "Your attitude," she said after a moment, as if grasping for justification. "Something about this doesn't sit right with me." Marcus's jaw tightened, but his composure remained intact. He could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, the indignity of being treated as a suspect in his own neighborhood. Yet he knew better than to let it show. This wasn't the place for anger, no matter how justified. "Officer," he said, his tone measured, "I have complied with everything you've asked. I've given you no reason to escalate this further. I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing." His words were calm, almost gentle, but they carried the weight of a lifetime spent navigating moments like this. Grace blinked, taken aback by his steady gaze. For a fleeting second, she wondered if she had misjudged him. But the instinct, the training, the stories she had heard, the unspoken rules of her world, clung to her, clouding her judgment. Before she could respond, Marcus reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out his phone. He made a quick call, his voice calm and businesslike, offering no explanation. Grace watched, her hand instinctively brushing against the edge of her holster. She didn't stop him, though her unease grew with every passing second. When Marcus ended the call, he turned to her, his expression unchanged. "I suggest we wait here for a few minutes," he said quietly. "Is that a threat?" Grace asked, her voice sharp, though it wavered slightly. "No," Marcus replied. "It's a warning." The silence between them stretched, heavy and unyielding. Grace shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her confidence beginning to erode. She glanced at the neighbors still watching, their faces obscured but their presence undeniable. The patrol car's lights continued to flash, a relentless reminder of the moment unfolding on this otherwise quiet street. The minutes passed, each one longer than the last. Then, a second car appeared, its headlights cutting through the dusk. It pulled up behind Grace's cruiser, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out, his expression grim. Grace straightened instinctively, her hand falling away from her holster. The man approached quickly, his eyes darting between Grace and Marcus. "Officer Carter," he said, his tone clipped. "What exactly are you doing here?" Grace hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "Investigating a suspicious vehicle," she said finally, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. The man's gaze hardened. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked, gesturing toward Marcus. Grace blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "He's the suspect in a potential stolen vehicle case," she said weakly. The man exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "This is Judge Marcus Hill," he said, his voice low but firm. "One of the most respected judges in this state. And you've just unlawfully detained him." The weight of his words sank into the air, pressing down on Grace with an intensity she couldn't ignore. Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had seen this moment coming, though it did little to ease the sting of it. The air around them felt heavier now, weighted by the gravity of the unfolding moment. Officer Grace Carter stood rigidly, her arms at her sides, unsure where to place them. Her training had prepared her for countless scenarios: domestic disturbances, traffic stops, even armed confrontations. But not this. not the searing discomfort of realizing she had miscalculated in the worst possible way. The man in the suit, Captain Roger Fields, her direct superior, turned his sharp gaze to her. He spoke in a tone that was low but carried the kind of authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. "Officer Carter," he said, the words deliberate, each syllable measured. "What were you thinking?" Grace swallowed hard, searching for a response that wouldn't sound like an excuse. I was investigating a potential stolen vehicle, sir," she managed, her voice quieter now, almost unsure of itself. It matched the description of what, exactly? Captain Fields interrupted. "A car you didn't recognize in a neighborhood you assumed he didn't belong in? Is that what we're calling police work now?" The words stung, cutting through the layers of confidence Grace had built during her years on the force. She had prided herself on being thorough, on keeping her community safe. Yet standing here now, under her captain's scrutiny and Judge Hill's silent gaze, she felt exposed. Marcus Hill had not moved from his position beside his car. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his posture as steady as his expression. He wasn't gloating, and wasn't demanding an apology or retribution. He simply watched, his presence alone carrying the weight of unspoken truths. Captain Fields turned to Marcus, his tone shifting to one of measured respect. "Judge Hill," he began, "on behalf of this department, I want to sincerely apologize for what has happened here tonight. This should never have occurred." Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the words but saying nothing. The silence stretched between them, and it was Grace who broke it, her voice faltering as she stepped forward. "Sir, I didn't know who you were," she said, her eyes meeting Marcus's for the first time since the captain's arrival. I made a mistake." Marcus regarded her for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. Then, in a voice as calm as the evening air, he replied, "You didn't know who I was. But that shouldn't matter, should it?" The question hung there, unanswerable in its simplicity. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She felt the heat rising to her face, a mix of embarrassment and something deeper, shame, perhaps, or the unsettling realization that she had acted on assumptions she had never questioned. Captain Fields exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. "Officer Carter," he said, his tone firm, "this was not just a mistake. This was a failure to act with the professionalism and fairness that this badge represents. And it's unacceptable." Grace's hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Intentions were irrelevant when the impact was so clear. "I understand, sir," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The neighbors had begun to retreat, their curiosity satisfied, their lights flickering off one by one. The street grew quieter, the hum of the patrol car's engine the only sound that lingered. Marcus glanced around, taking in the emptying porches, the darkened windows. He had lived in this neighborhood for years, but at this moment, it felt different, smaller, more fragile. Turning back to Captain Fields, Marcus spoke with the same deliberate calm that had carried him through countless courtrooms. "Captain, I don't want her fired." Grace's eyes snapped to his. Startled, she had braced herself for the worst. For disciplinary hearings, suspension, maybe even termination, but his words cut through her expectations like a blade. Marcus continued, his voice steady, "I don't believe punishment alone is the solution here. What I need is for this department to take a hard look at how something like this happens. I want real change, training, education, accountability." Captain Fields nodded slowly, his expression softening. "You have my word, Judge Hill. We will address this. This department will not sweep this under the rug." Marcus studied him for a moment, then turned his attention back to Grace. His gaze was not unkind, but it was unyielding. "Officer Carter," he said, "you have a responsibility to yourself, to this badge, to the people you serve. To confront the assumptions you carry. What happened tonight could have ended very differently. For both of us. I hope you take that to heart." Grace swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I will, sir," she said, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded once, then turned toward his car. He moved with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. His steps measured, his head held high. As he opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, their glow softening the hard edges of the night. Grace watched him drive away, the taillights of his car disappearing into the distance. She felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a heavy cloak. The realization of what had transpired sinking in fully. Captain Fields placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice softer now but no less firm. "You have work to do, Carter. Don't waste this moment." And with that, he walked back to his car, leaving Grace alone in the quiet street. She stood there for a long time, the words of both men echoing in her mind, their weight pressing against the walls of her certainty. The badge on her chest felt heavier now, no longer just a symbol of authority but a reminder of the responsibility she carried. The drive home was quiet, the kind of stillness that let thoughts grow louder. Marcus Hill's hands rested on the steering wheel, his grip relaxed yet purposeful. The road stretched ahead, lit by the soft glow of streetlights, each one passing in rhythm with his steady breath. He had lived in this neighborhood for nearly a decade, but tonight, it felt unfamiliar, as though the evening's events had shifted its contours, revealing something previously unseen. The words of Officer Carter and Captain Fields replayed in his mind, their voices overlapping with memories of other encounters. Moments from his past, sharp and clear, intruded on the present. The time a shopkeeper had followed him through an upscale department store. His presence was an unspoken question. The time a waiter had served him last, despite arriving first. The time a colleague had assumed he was the chauffeur, not the keynote speaker. Marcus had learned long ago how to endure such moments with grace, how to carry himself in a way that disarmed suspicion. Yet tonight, as the flashing lights faded into the distance, he found himself wondering why he still had to. After all these years, all his achievements, the weight of proving himself had not lessened. The house came into view, its warm lights spilling across the manicured lawn. It was a modest but elegant home, one he and Eleanor had chosen together in those early days of his judgeship. He parked the car in the driveway and sat for a moment, letting the engine idle before turning it off. Inside, the familiar comforts of home awaited him, the worn leather armchair by the fireplace, the framed photographs on the mantel, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. But tonight, even these comforts felt distant. He stepped inside, the air still carrying traces of the lavender candles Eleanor had always loved. Though she had been gone for years, her presence lingered in the small details she had left behind. Marcus set his briefcase on the kitchen counter and poured himself a glass of water, his reflection in the window catching his eye. The man who looked back was steady, composed, yet beneath the surface, there was a weariness that had grown with time. Across town, Grace Carter sat at her desk, the fluorescent light overhead casting a pale glow across the room. Her patrol shift had ended hours ago, but she hadn't gone home. Instead, she found herself here, staring at a blank report form on her computer screen. The words wouldn't come. How could she describe what had happened without facing the truth of it? She had profiled him. She had looked at a man like Judge Hill, dignified, accomplished, calm, and seen a suspect. The realization gnawed at her, its edges sharp and unrelenting. Her training manuals sat stacked neatly on a nearby shelf, their spines unbroken. She thought of the words etched into her badge, protect and serve. They had always seemed so simple, so self-explanatory, but tonight, they felt heavy with implications she hadn't considered deeply enough. Grace leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The moments of the stop replayed in her mind, each one punctuated by the quiet restraint of the man she had wronged. Judge Hill's calm demeanor had unnerved her in a way she hadn't expected. He hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened, hadn't even raised his voice. Yet every word he spoke carried a weight that left her questioning everything she thought she knew. That night, both Marcus and Grace found themselves reaching for clarity in their own ways. Marcus pulled out a leather-bound notebook from his desk drawer, its pages filled with musings he rarely shared. Writing had always been his way of making sense of the world, a habit he developed during long nights as a young attorney. He began to write, his pen moving steadily across the page. Asterisk. How do you dismantle something so ingrained it becomes invisible? How do you fight a bias so deeply rooted it feels like instinct? Today was not the first time I faced this question, nor will it be the last. But it strikes me that the fight cannot be mine alone. Across town, Grace opened her laptop and began researching. The articles she found were sobering. Statistics on racial profiling, stories of wrongful detentions, and personal accounts from those who had been on the receiving end of assumptions like hers. Each story chipped away at the wall of justification she had built around herself. For the first time, she began to see the patterns not as isolated incidents, but as a thread running through the fabric of her profession. She closed the laptop, her heart heavy. This wasn't just about Judge Hill. It was about something larger. Something she was now painfully aware she had been complicit in. She thought of his words. Asterisk. You have a responsibility to confront the assumptions you carry. They echoed in her mind. Not as an accusation, but as a call to action. Morning came quietly, the sun rising over a city still waking. Marcus sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the cool morning air. A few neighbors passed by, offering polite waves but nothing more. He returned the gesture, his thoughts distant. The world would keep moving. He knew, but the events of the previous night had left a mark on him. On Grace, perhaps even on the community. He thought of Eleanor again, of her unwavering belief in the power of understanding. She had always been the optimist, the one who saw possibilities where others saw only barriers. Marcus wasn't sure he shared her optimism, but he felt a responsibility to honor it. As he sipped his coffee, he resolved to do more than reflect. Change, he knew, required more than quiet contemplation. It required action, and while he couldn't rewrite what had happened, he could use it, turn it into a moment that mattered. Not just for himself but for those who would never have the chance to demand accountability. Somewhere in the city, Grace Carter prepared to face her own day. Her steps uncertain but purposeful. Both of them carried the weight of the previous night, their lives moving forward along paths that had briefly and profoundly intersected. Neither knew what the future held, but both understood this much. The fight for justice was not just a matter of law, but of heart, mind, and will. The courtroom felt quieter than usual, though it was filled with people. Marcus Hill sat at the bench, his gavel untouched beside him. He wasn't presiding over a trial today. Instead, he was addressing a different kind of audience: community leaders, law enforcement representatives, and members of the public who had gathered to discuss what had happened. This wasn't a courtroom proceeding but a forum, one Marcus had insisted on. He believed that what had transpired during his traffic stop was a symptom of a deeper issue, one that couldn't be resolved with disciplinary action alone. He looked out over the crowd, taking in the faces before him. Some looked curious, others guarded, and a few openly skeptical. At the edge of the room sat Officer Grace Carter, her posture stiff but her gaze steady. She had come willingly, though Marcus suspected it had not been an easy decision. He began to speak, his voice steady and deliberate. The events of that evening are not unique, he said, his words cutting through the room's stillness. What happened to me has happened to countless others, many of whom didn't have the privilege of a title or position to protect them. There was a shift in the room, rustling as people adjusted in their seats. Marcus continued, his tone calm but firm. I was stopped because of an assumption, one rooted in something far older and deeper than any one individual. It's an assumption that has shaped laws, policies, and, yes, the way we see each other. And until we confront it directly, it will continue to shape our actions. Grace Carter listened intently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had spent the days since the stop reflecting on her actions, questioning the instincts she had once trusted implicitly. She had replayed the moment in her mind over and over, her own voice echoing back to her. Asterisk. Is this your car? Step out of the vehicle. Each time, she felt the same hollow ache of regret. Now, sitting here in the presence of the man she had wronged, Grace felt something else: an unfamiliar but undeniable pull toward understanding. She had read about implicit bias, about how it worked in ways people often didn't realize. But hearing Judge Hill speak about it made it feel real in a way that no article or training manual ever had. After Marcus finished speaking, he opened the floor for questions. A middle-aged woman raised her hand, her expression cautious. Judge Hill, she began, do you really believe these issues can be solved through conversation? I mean, doesn't it require something more concrete? Marcus nodded thoughtfully. You're right that change requires action. But action begins with understanding. Policies can be rewritten, and training programs can be implemented. But until we address the assumptions that shape our perceptions, those changes will only scratch the surface. A young man in a police uniform spoke next. How do we unlearn something we don't even realize we're doing? The question hung in the air, its simplicity masking the complexity beneath. Marcus paused before answering. It starts with listening, he said, not just to respond, but to truly hear. It starts with acknowledging that we all carry biases, whether we're aware of them or not. And it continues with a willingness to confront them, not defensively, but openly. His gaze shifted toward Grace, who straightened slightly in her seat. It also requires accountability, he added, not punishment for its own sake, but a commitment to do better. To learn, to grow, and to change. As the forum continued, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. What had started as a tense gathering softened into something else. An exchange. A shared reckoning with truths that had too often been ignored. Grace listened as others spoke, their stories blending with her own thoughts. She felt the weight of their words, the quiet urgency behind them. When the forum ended, people began to file out, their faces contemplative. Grace lingered, unsure of whether to approach Judge Hill. But as she stood, he caught her eye and gave a small nod, inviting her over. She walked toward him, her steps measured. When she reached him, she spoke softly. Judge Hill, I want to thank you for the way you handled all of this. You could have demanded consequences, and no one would have blamed you. But instead, you chose to make it about something bigger. Marcus regarded her with the same calm composure he had shown that night. Officer Carter, he said, accountability isn't just about consequences. It's about growth, and growth is a choice. She nodded, her throat tightening. I've started to realize how much I have to learn, she admitted, and I'm committed to doing that. To being better. Marcus studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. That's a good place to start. She shook his hand, the gesture simple but significant. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't expected, hope. Not just for herself, but for the possibility that moments like this could lead to something greater. As Marcus left the courthouse, the evening air felt lighter than it had in days. He knew this was only a beginning, a small step in a journey that stretched far beyond him. But as he walked to his car, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. In the distance, the city moved on, its rhythms unchanged, but within this small space, something had shifted. An acknowledgement, a conversation, a start, and sometimes, Marcus thought, a start was enough. The days following the forum passed quietly, the hum of daily life returning to its usual rhythm. Yet for Marcus Hill, the silence was deceptive. Beneath it, there was a stir, a growing awareness that the events of that evening, and the conversations it had sparked, were not so easily forgotten. At his kitchen table one morning, Marcus read through the letters and emails that had begun to arrive. Many were from strangers, people who had heard about what happened and felt compelled to share their own stories. Some wrote with gratitude, thanking him for handling the situation with dignity. Others wrote with frustration, recounting their own experiences with racial profiling. Their words heavy with a weariness that Marcus understood all too well. One letter in particular caught his attention. It was handwritten, the penmanship uneven but careful. Judge Hill. It began. I'm a retired schoolteacher, and I wanted to thank you for speaking out about what happened to you. My grandson, who's only 16, had a similar experience last year. But he didn't have your composure, or your connections. The police treated him like a criminal for riding his bike in the wrong neighborhood. He hasn't been the same since. Your story reminded me that these things aren't isolated. They're part of something much bigger. And we all need to face it. Marcus set the letter down. His thoughts drifting. The writer was right. This wasn't just about him. Or even about Officer Carter. It was about a system of assumptions that stretched across generations. Reinforced by history and habit. Changing it would take more than conversations, it would take persistence. And courage. And an unwavering belief in the possibility of progress. Across town, Grace Carter was having her own reckoning. Since the forum, she had thrown herself into understanding the biases that had shaped her actions. She had started reading books, attending workshops, even talking with colleagues who had faced discrimination within the department. Each step felt like peeling back a layer, exposing truths she hadn't wanted to see. One evening, she found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her uniform neatly pressed, her badge gleaming under the bathroom light. It had always been a symbol of pride for her, a reminder of her role in keeping the community safe. But now, it felt like a question. What does it mean to protect and serve? If the people you're protecting don't feel safe around you? She thought of Judge Hill's words during the forum. Accountability isn't just about consequences. It's about growth. It had stayed with her. Not as a reprimand, but as a challenge. Grace didn't know if she could ever fully atone for what had happened. But she knew she had to try. That weekend, the local community center hosted a panel discussion on trust between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. Marcus had been invited to speak. And he arrived to find the room filled with people from all walks of life, students, retirees, business owners, clergy. Among them were several uniformed officers, including Grace, who sat near the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The panel began with a local pastor, who spoke about the need for compassion and understanding. A small business owner followed, sharing how economic disparities often compounded feelings of distrust. When it was Marcus's turn, the room fell silent, the audience leaning in to hear his measured voice. What I've come to understand, he said, is that trust is not built in moments of agreement. It's built in moments of accountability. It's built when we confront the things we don't want to admit, about ourselves, about our systems, about our history. He glanced at Grace, whose eyes met his for a fleeting moment before she looked down. But accountability isn't about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about asking ourselves what we can do to be better. Not just as individuals, but as a society. It's about recognizing that the work of justice is never finished. After the panel ended, people lingered, forming small clusters to discuss what they had heard. Marcus found himself surrounded by a group of young college students. Their questions sharp and thoughtful. He answered them patiently, knowing that their curiosity was a sign of something hopeful, a generation eager to understand and to act. As the crowd began to thin, Grace approached him hesitantly. She was out of uniform, her demeanor quieter, almost unsure. Judge Hill, she said softly, thank you for what you said tonight. Marcus nodded, his expression kind but reserved. Thank you for being here. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. She continued, and I know I have a long way to go. But I want to be part of the change you're talking about. I don't want what happened to define who I am, or what I stand for. Marcus studied her for a moment, then offered a small, encouraging smile, acknowledging where you are as the first step. The next is deciding where you want to go. Grace nodded, her shoulders straightening slightly. It wasn't absolution. She hadn't expected that. But it felt like something better. A chance to rebuild. To learn. To grow. That night, as Marcus drove home, he thought about the threads connecting their stories. He thought about the young man on the bicycle, the retired teacher, the students with their eager questions. Each one was part of the larger fabric he had spent his life trying to mend. The road ahead was long, and the destination uncertain, but as the city lights shimmered in the distance, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet hope. Change didn't come quickly, or easily, but it came. One conversation, one step, one decision at a time. The morning was unusually quiet in the courthouse as Marcus Hill entered his chambers. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows on the wooden floors. Outside, the city moved on, its rhythm unbroken. But inside this space, Marcus felt a different kind of stillness. The kind that invited reflection. He had spent decades in rooms like this, where words shaped outcomes and decisions carried weight. Yet today felt different. The case he would preside over wasn't extraordinary, but the events of the past weeks had shifted something in him. It wasn't just about interpreting the law anymore. It was about what the law represented and the humanity it was meant to protect. Later that afternoon, Marcus stepped into a local high school auditorium, where he had agreed to speak to a group of students about the justice system. It wasn't a setting he was accustomed to, but he had felt a pull to connect with younger generations, to help them see beyond the stereotypes and assumptions that often clouded understanding. The students were diverse, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism as they watched him take the stage. Marcus began not with legal jargon but with a story. His own. I grew up in a neighborhood where the idea of justice felt distant, he said, his voice calm and steady. It was something we talked about in abstract terms, something we hoped for but didn't always see. I decided to become a lawyer because I believed in the promise of justice. But what I've learned over the years is that justice is not just about laws. It's about people, it's about trust. And trust is something that has to be earned, over and over again. He spoke of the challenges he had faced, not as a judge but as a man navigating a world that often made assumptions about him. He spoke of the power of listening, of asking questions, of being willing to confront uncomfortable truths. And as he spoke, he saw the students lean in, their skepticism giving way to understanding. That evening, Marcus returned to his neighborhood, where the streetlights flickered softly in the early twilight. He noticed one of his neighbors, a man in his late 70s, sitting on his porch. The man raised a hand in greeting, and Marcus walked over, his steps unhurried. Judge Hill, the man said, shifting slightly in his chair. I heard about what happened with the officer. I just wanted to say, well, I didn't know. Marcus regarded him for a moment, his expression calm. Didn't know what? He asked gently. The man hesitated, then sighed. Didn't know it was still like this. I thought we'd come farther than that. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. It's easy to think that when it doesn't touch your life, he said, but the truth is, these things don't just go away. They evolve, and if we don't address them, they linger, quietly shaping the way we live. The man shifted again, his face troubled. What do we do, then? Marcus took a deep breath, letting the question settle. We start by paying attention, he said, by recognizing the assumptions we carry, the things we take for granted. And then we act. Not just when it's convenient, but consistently. It's not about fixing everything at once. It's about making small, steady changes. The man nodded, his eyes distant. Small changes, he murmured. Maybe that's how it starts. Inside his home, Marcus sat by the fireplace, a cup of tea warming his hands. The day had been long, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. The ripples of that evening with Officer Carter had reached farther than he'd anticipated. Conversations were happening, shifts were beginning, however small they might be. He thought of Eleanor, of the way she had always encouraged him to see the possibilities in people, even when it was difficult. He smiled faintly, her voice echoing in his memory. It's not about changing the whole world, Marcus. It's about changing your part of it. Across town, Grace Carter sat at her desk, pen in hand. She was writing a letter. Not one she expected to send, but one she needed to write. It was addressed to Judge Hill, and in it, she tried to put into words what the experience had taught her. I've come to realize how much I didn't see, she wrote. Not because it wasn't there, but because I didn't want to look. I want you to know that your words have stayed with me. Not just as a lesson, but as a challenge. I won't forget them. She set the pen down, her thoughts still turning. The letter felt unfinished, but maybe that was the point. The work was unfinished too. For her, for Marcus, for everyone. As the night settled over the city, Marcus closed his notebook and set it aside. Outside, the world continued its quiet, ceaseless motion. But inside his home, there was peace, a kind of peace that came not from resolution, but from the knowledge that he had done what he could. And tomorrow, he would begin again.